Hi everyone, warm welcome to you. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Chris Payne and I'm the Director of International Alumni Engagement at Georgetown Law. We're delighted to see so many of you joining us today for our special event with Professor Feinerman. Today's event is part of our 150th anniversary celebrations and it's the second event of our International Conversation series. If you haven't had the chance to do so already, I hope you take a moment today to look at our website to share your memories and watch live and on-demand events to celebrate our 150 years of Georgetown Law. Before I hand over to Tom Kellogg, our Executive Director of the Georgetown Center for Asian Law, and to introduce Professor Feinerman and kick off our conversation, I wanted to give you a brief highlight of today's conversation and how you can participate. Feel free to ask a question anytime in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And around 8:45, we'll move to a general Q&A. We'll be able to ask any questions and we'll answer your questions accordingly. After which, we'll invite you all to join us live on screen and you can answer and ask your questions in person. And at that time, please feel free to raise your hand using the raise your hand feature at the bottom of the screen. Or if you're unable to find that, please feel free to wave and we'll try our best to find you. I do want to note that today's event is being recorded, and so this will be made available on demand as well after today's event. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Tom to kick off our conversation. Tom, over to you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Chris, and it's good to be with you. I do want to say thank you to your office for making this exciting conversation possible. I'll just say a word or two about Jim's illustrious career by way of introduction, and then we'll jump into the conversation. Obviously, as everyone on this conference knows, Dr. James Feinerman, Jim to his friends, is the Morita Professor of Asian Legal Studies at Georgetown, and he's also the faculty director for the Center for Asian Law. And believe it or not, he's also the faculty director for another center at Georgetown, the newly created Denny Center for Democratic Capitalism. He's a leading specialist, of course, on Chinese and Japanese law, and he's taught courses on those subjects since arriving at Georgetown in 1985. He's also written widely on developments in Asian law for both scholarly and public-facing outlets, and I've been a regular consumer of his scholarly work and commentaries, certainly well before I myself came to Georgetown 3 years ago. He's also served Georgetown in many different capacities, including most recently as Associate Dean for Transnational Programs, and he stepped down from that post after a 7-year tenure this past summer. That's an obviously all too brief summary of Jim's accolades and accomplishments, but I do want to leave it there just so that we can jump into the Q&A, our conversation, and then to your questions. So Jim, if I can start off with a sort of a broader question about your own sort of background, can you talk a little bit about how you got interested in Asia and some of your early experiences living and working there?
Yes, thank you, Tom, for the introduction, and Chris for arranging this this conversation with our students and alumni. I would start out by saying that this is a year of anniversaries in many ways for me. It's the 50th anniversary of my first visit to Asia. Wow! In 1971, after I had just graduated from college. It's also the year that, or this semester, that marks, and I'm dating myself here, the time that I began as a 15-year-old sophomore in high school studying the Chinese language. Wow. So it's a bit of an embarrassing story. It wasn't any choice of mine. I went to a Jesuit boys' high school in the suburbs of Chicago, Loyola Academy. And it's sort of ironic that I've ended up spending the last 35 years of my life at a Jesuit institution, Georgetown. But they decided after our freshman year that they were going to start teaching the Chinese language. They were already teaching multiple modern foreign languages, including Spanish, French, German, Russian. And they decided that it was time, given the geopolitical situation and modern life in the 20th century, to offer a class in Chinese. And the way that they put the class together was they took the top 20 boys based on our freshman Latin exam, which everyone had to take in the freshman class. And if you were good at Latin, you were obviously good at languages, and learning Chinese would be a snap. So they put us into a Chinese class with a Chinese priest, Father John, who was our Chinese teacher for what turned out to be my sophomore and junior years. And by my senior year, a very experienced teacher who had been on the faculty of the Far Eastern Languages Institute at Yale came to our school, Joseph Guo. And Mr. Guo was the last high school Chinese teacher that I had. And so one thing sort of led to another, and it's embarrassing to say that I rather fell into this career, not through any active choice, but sort of series of accidental events that heightened my interest and made me move on. It wasn't until I got to college, actually, at Yale, when I finally started studying anything about China other than its language. So by that time, I had had 3 years of high school Chinese, a summer at the University of Wisconsin, taking an advanced modern Chinese language course. And I had my first opportunity to study Chinese history, Chinese literature, Chinese political science. And luckily for me, Yale was a great place to do this. The historian couple, Arthur and Mary Wright, had come to Yale a few years before I did. He was a pre-modern Chinese historian. She was a historian of 19th and 20th century China. And I had the very good fortune to take a sophomore seminar with her just before, unfortunately, she died the following summer. But she set the course of much of the rest of my undergraduate career. I ended up doing a senior thesis with one of the younger Chinese historians on the faculty, Don Price. And here's the tie-in to the 50th anniversary. At the end of my senior year, I received a fellowship from an organization known as, at that time, Yale in China. It's now the Yale China Association, which had been set up in the early 20th century, 1901 to be exact, to send Yale graduates to China until 1949, and after that to Hong Kong, which is where I went in 1971, to teach English as a foreign language. For 2 years, we were known as Yali Bachelors. The organization's name in Chinese was the Yali Xiehui, the sort of Yale Friendship Association. And the Yale Bachelors, up until that year, actually, they were all male bachelors. It was a requirement that, among other things, you had to be unmarried, but it was a bachelor by degree as well, because we just received our bachelor's degrees at Yale College. Well, my class at Yale was the first class to have women graduates in it. Women in my class and the class behind me, 72, had transferred from other schools. And so I went out with the first Yale bachelorette. They kept on trying to figure out a name for her that wasn't going to be demeaning or insulting. I just decided to call us both bachelors based on our degrees. But Kim Chang, who was in that first class of women at Yale and had transferred from Smith, was already fluent in Chinese. Her father was originally from mainland China and came to New York to work for the United Nations. And so she grew up in a Chinese-speaking household. She and I both had pretty advanced Chinese by the time we got to Hong Kong. And the one thing that we didn't have was Cantonese. And it turned out that Mandarin Chinese in 1971 was not a very useful commodity. So we ended up taking intensive Cantonese instruction, which the university we were at, the Chinese University of Hong Kong's New Asia College, had a language teaching institute that trained everyone from foreign correspondents to missionaries in both Mandarin and Cantonese. And so they put together a special class for us because we already knew Mandarin with a teacher who was fluent in both Mandarin and Cantonese. And after 3 months of 15 hours a week study, we were launched. We were sort of able to work in both Cantonese and Mandarin. But our primary job, of course, was teaching English language to students who were in the freshman and sophomore classes at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. It also was historic in a couple of other ways because it just happened to coincide, and this is another lucky accident in my life, with Richard Nixon's announcing his visit to China. He, of course, yes. He announced that summer, as I was going off to Hong Kong, that he was going to go to China, which he did in February of 1972. And all of a sudden, this foreign entity that we had almost no contact with for 3 decades, was opening up, or at least it seemed, to the West. It still wasn't possible for Americans to go to mainland China. And in fact, most foreigners had not been able to go to China until the late 60s. And just as China was opening up to Canada, France, and a number of other countries around the world, the Cultural Revolution broke out in China. So it didn't seem like an auspicious time for people to be establishing relations. And in fact, the British correspondent and the people who worked in the British embassy were dragged through the streets in China during the height of the Cultural Revolution. And so it seemed like Hong Kong was a nice, safe place to view China from nearby, but not too close for comfort. And it was an extraordinary time because as China opened up, Hong Kong obviously became the window on China. And it had been for many years, but now that there was much more access, we could learn a whole lot more. People were coming out from mainland China. Americans who went in on brief visits had an opportunity to go and sort of see things on a 2 or 3 week trip. Some of them, were selectively chosen because of their political affiliations. Others were chosen because of their prominence as, politicians or cultural figures. But eventually, over that next decade, from 1971 to 1979, when we finally established full normal relations with China, we had a growing, relationship that wasn't completely normal, but also wasn't completely closed off as it had been during the Cold War.
Yeah. Well, that just one quick follow-up question on that piece of it. When did you yourself first make it to Beijing? Because as you were obviously alluding to, Hong Kong and Beijing couldn't be more different at that moment in time, both linguistically, culturally, politically, and otherwise. What was your first visit to Beijing, and what were your first impressions when you finally got there?
Well, I'll give you a slight segue to get to 1979, when I went to China in the second wave of the first group of American students to go to China in 30 years. That happened for me in September of 1979. But how I got there was after my 2 years of teaching English as a foreign language in Hong Kong, I decided to go back to graduate school at Yale and study East Asian languages and literatures. And while I was there in my second year in graduate school, one of my college classmates who had gone directly to Harvard Law School said, "There's this guy here who teaches Chinese law, and I know what academic life is like and how hard it is to get jobs." This was the 1970s, and the United States was in the midst of a recession. He said, "You should come to law school and get a real job." It seemed rather insulting to the faculty who were teaching me in other departments at Yale.
Yes.
But I inquired, and as you know, because you were also someone who became one of his disciples, the attractive power of Professor Jerome Allen Cohen, who had started really the field of Chinese law studies in the United States, was incredibly powerful. He basically, said, when I wrote him at the behest of my college classmate and said, "I'm interested in the program you had," he was, the ultimate huckster. He said, "Well, why don't you come up for a couple of days? We'll show you around. You can meet the people in the program. You can see the rest of the faculty at Harvard." And he said, "I went to Yale myself, but Harvard's really better."
It's a sensitive issue, Jim. It's a sensitive
Yes.
issue.
Well, so I made a 2-day visit. I was a graduate student and my schedule was pretty flexible. And before I knew it, I got a letter from Jerry 2 days before I got the actual admissions office letter from Harvard saying, "Delighted you've been admitted, hope you'll come." And so after 2 years of graduate school, I took my oral exams on the last day of August in 1975, so that I'd be qualified to start the dissertation part of my PhD. And then the next day I went up to Cambridge and became a first-year law student at Harvard. And to make a very long story short, I spent my first year at law school at Harvard. I thought that I could have some dissertation writing opportunities in my spare time. I quickly discovered that law school allowed no spare time. So
yeah, you're not the first to have that hope and see it dashed.
I took a leave of absence after my first year to go back to New Haven and hopefully write my dissertation in a year. I didn't quite complete that, I finished a first draft of the dissertation, working very closely with my my mentor, who ironically, just after I finished both programs in law and the PhD at Yale, moved from New Haven to Cambridge, Steve Owen, who's now a university professor, probably about to become emeritus at Harvard. But when I found out years later that he was negotiating with Harvard, I said, "Why didn't you leave 2 years earlier? You know, my life would have been so much simpler if I hadn't just had to." I basically was shuttling back and forth between New Haven and Cambridge for my last 2 years of law school. And as it turned out, I got my law degree and my PhD 3 weeks apart. I turned in my dissertation at Yale in April of 1979, and I got my PhD in late May. And then 3 weeks later, I got my JD at Harvard. And by that time, I knew I'd been selected for this program to go to Beijing. So I worked for a summer at the law firm that I was going to eventually come back and join, Davis Polk in New York, and took the bar review course at night. And I took the bar exam, and then 3 weeks later, I was on a flight to Hong Kong, and then a 26-hour train ride with a stopover in Guangzhou that got me to Beijing in early September of 1979. And it was an extraordinary experience. 7 American students had gone in the first group in March, right after official relations were established. They wanted to, get in immediately. And then another 23 of us came to complete the cohort of 30 who were that first group of American students to go to China. And surprisingly, I think, given the state of the field at the time, 5 of the 30 of us were law students or law school graduates. So in addition to me, there were my classmate from Harvard Law School, Tim Gillette, Ellen Eliasoff, who was still in her second year at Yale Law School, and then Druid Cameron and Susan Gruneberg, both of whom had graduated from law school already, Druid from Iowa and Susan from UCLA. And all of us had studied Chinese extensively. All of us had taken, when it was possible, courses in something like Chinese law. Although I remember that the course I took from Jerry Cohen in Chinese law, he began, the first thing you need to know about Chinese law is there isn't any. Pause for dramatic effect. And they say, well, let's spend the next 14 weeks, sort of sketching this out, but there actually is some stuff, and, we'll make the most of it. He had already written a book about criminal process in the People's Republic of China. He was working on a couple of books about Chinese practice of international law with a younger law professor from Taiwan at the University of Maryland's law school, Hung Da Cho. And as a result, there was something to study out there, even in the late 1970s, but the information was small. When we got to Beijing, one of the things that, of course, all 5 of us were interested in doing was beginning to study Chinese law at the law faculty at Peking University, which was where we all were sent. And upon our arrival, we were told that we couldn't study law. Law was an extremely secret discipline. Chui Mi was the term that was used in Chinese. And as a result, we had to disport ourselves among other departments at Harvard. So 3 of the students decided to go into economics. That was the department. There were only 4 departments that were formally open to foreign students at that time. Chinese, which included literature as well as linguistics, history, economics, and philosophy. And they decided that economics was the closest thing to law, so that we should probably do that. But I decided, because I had done my PhD in literature, to go into the Chinese literature department. And Tim, who had majored in history as an undergraduate at Penn, decided to go to the history department. So we took classes in things that were completely unrelated to law, but tried to start finding out things that we could learn about the Chinese legal system. And one of the things that we all did was get involved in translating whatever material we could get our hands on about Chinese law. So my roommate, who was a fellow Chinese literature department student, all of us were paired in rooms where we lived with a Chinese roommate, and the roommate was chosen from the same department that we were in. He told me that just that month, September of 1979, in the People's Literature magazine, Renmin Wenxue, There had just been published an article that I might be interested in because it seemed to have some connection with law. And it turned out to be an article by a very famous Chinese writer who had been purged after the 100 Flowers movement, but had reemerged with the death of Mao and the rise of Deng Xiaoping, a man named Liu Binyan. And Liu Binyan had written this piece that was the first in a series of what were called Baogao Wenxue, reportage literature, called Ren Yao Zhijian, Between People and Monsters, was the title translated roughly into English. And so I started translating it with the help of my roommate and a guy across the hall who was from Harbin, because the article, the reportage was set in a county in Harbin province in China, in Heilongjiang, in Harbin city's nearby county. And so there's a lot of Tuhua, sort of a local patois that wasn't standard Chinese in the article. And so Zhang Wenran, who's now teaching at a university in Canada, helped me with that because he was a native of Heilongjiang. And eventually it was discovered that I was working on this at the same time that a Chinese literature specialist at Princeton, Perry Link, was trying to put together a series of things that were about the modern reportage coming out of China. And so he worked with me on the translation and helped polish it and make it, I think, more literary. Mine was a pretty rough original translation. And it came out as the lead article or the lead story in a book that was entitled People or Monsters, that included the writings of Liu Binyan. So I managed to tie my legal interest in with my literary studies that I was officially allowed to do. The five of us also got together on a first book that was published by the Chinese People's Procuracy that laid out explanations about the new criminal procedure law that had just been passed in 1979 and went into effect in January of 1980. And so we translated that book, all five of us working together. And that eventually came out in a publication in the United States in a Chinese Law Reporter that was published by a series of political scientists working at the University of Maryland and elsewhere. So despite spending my time studying Chinese poetry, which I was very happy to do again, I had excellent teachers. I had a class in the Chinese vaudeville routine known as Shangshang that was taught by Hou Baolin, who was described at the time as the Bob Hope of China. And it was fascinating because he was a major cultural figure. And some of his work, was just incredibly funny and also very politically edgy. He had a routine that actually was translated later by a husband and wife couple, Jay and Linda Matthews, who were correspondents. He was for the Washington Post and she was for the Los Angeles Times in China at the time, that described an experience in a revolutionary photography party, where in the photography parlor, you had to say sort of politically correct things. So, people say, all power to the revolution, could you please develop these photographs? And they say, political power grows from the battle of a gun. That'll be 6 kwai. And the routine was like that. He also described how he was going to, get into the business of teaching English, which was, very, very important in China at the time. Everyone was trying to learn English. People would, accost you on the streets if they saw that you were a foreigner and assume that you had to be an English speaker and try to practice their English on you. So he had a routine about how he set up a school to teach the 17 most important letters of the alphabet in English. And of course, somebody said, well, there are actually 26 letters of the alphabet. And he said, the advertisement says we promise 75% results. So you get 75% of the alphabet. Go away, stop bothering me.
Well, let me jump in there, Jim, just to make sure that we cover. We may need to do a second session to make sure that we cover the fullness of your career. But I do want to make sure we spend some time talking about your time at Georgetown. You came, of course, to Georgetown in '85. And would love to get your impression both of what it was like then and what it was like to build up an Asia-focused law program in those first few years, excuse me?
Well, I was extremely lucky to get the offer to come to Georgetown. And I have to say that this is another example of just, maybe perfect timing or just dumb luck. But after 4 years of practicing law at my law firm in New York, I had been offered a position as a researcher and a teacher at Harvard Law School, my law school alma mater, and went there from 1983 to 85. I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do next. I could wait around and hope that they, gave me tenure. Or as it turned out, I got a phone call from two people who sort of made my way at Georgetown, Edie Brown Weiss and Barry Carter, who is unfortunately no longer with us. Edie had called at the behest of my law school classmate, Natalie Lichtenstein, who was teaching Chinese law at Georgetown at the time as an adjunct. And she had inherited that class from Bill Alford, another law school contemporary of mine. Bill had started doing this when he was an associate in the Washington office of Fried Frank, along with another Harvard graduate, Olin Wethington. But then Bill got offered a full-time teaching job at UCLA. So he left and bequeathed the course to Natalie, who had been working in the Treasury Department and then started when the Chinese government joined the World Bank as the first lawyer in the legal department, working with the Chinese member at the World Bank in the counsel's office. And they had gone to her and said, would you like to come on full time? We think Chinese law is going to be important in the future. And your work at the World Bank is interesting too. There are a number of courses you could teach for us. And Natalie said, I'm having too much fun, setting up this program at the World Bank. But my classmate, Jim Feinerman, may be looking around, so you should talk to him. So at the behest of Edie and Barry, I came down for a day-long interview at Georgetown. And Bob Petoskey called me back. He was the dean at the time, and said, we'd like to have you come. We consider this to be a trial for both us and you. Come for a year and we'll see if it works. And if it does, we'd like to have you join the faculty. So to my good fortune, Georgetown asked me to come after my 1 year. I came for a year, and now I've stayed for 35 years. It was just another one of those lucky breaks that happened in my career, both because of the timing. China was hot at the moment, and they were eager to get somebody. I was sort of a twofer or a threefer because I practiced law in the corporate area, so I could teach corporations, I could teach corporate finance, and I had studied other legal systems besides China's, including Japan's, and general comparative law as a law student. So my first year of teaching, my assignments were to teach comparative law, the general course, to teach Chinese law as a seminar, and then to teach a section of corporate finance. And so I've joked that ever since I've been asked to teach any course at Georgetown that starts with a C. This past semester, I've been teaching 2 sections of contracts. I've taught corporate governance. I've taught the basic corporations class. Every so often I get out of the C's. I've taught Japanese law, and I've taught a few other things besides. But the idea was that I would be the sort of general comparativist because there was nobody on the full-time faculty. There were a lot of adjuncts who taught courses in foreign and comparative law. And gradually the faculty grew. Well, one thing I would just note, just in terms of numbers, when I joined the full-time faculty, I was the 53rd member of the full-time faculty. This was 1987 when I finally became a fully appointed faculty member. The full-time faculty today is 130.
Wow. And
may grow a little bit when we make some appointments this academic year. And of course, the adjunct faculty has grown enormously as well. Those people who were teaching Chinese, Japanese law as adjuncts, they were at that time maybe about 200 or 300 taught very specific courses. And today we have over 700 adjunct faculty. So Georgetown truly is a legal cornucopia. It's a place where there's almost nothing that you can't study, and many things that you can study at a very advanced level, not just the basic class or even a basic class in a seminar, but
Mhm.
advanced classes and seminars in several areas because the size of our faculty, especially with the adjuncts, and the resources we can draw on here in Washington, D.C., both from the bench and the bar and the NGO community, means that we have just terrific possibilities.
Yes.
And I joke that there used to be a local bank that's now been bought up by outsiders called Riggs Bank. The ceremonial library on Georgetown's main campus is the Riggs Library, and Riggs had a long and storied history with Georgetown. But the Riggs Bank had an ad maybe 15, 20 years ago that said they were the most important bank in the most important city in the world, which may have been true, although some people would argue about Georgetown or Washington being the most important city in the world. But Georgetown Law School clearly is the most important law school in the most important city in the world. And that's been, a great thing for me, for our faculty, for our students and staff. It's turned out to be just an excellent place to try and do the kind of things that we do and connect with the world. One of the things that has been really important, I think, in my time at Georgetown, is how our connections have grown around the globe. By the time I arrived here, there had been 2 students who studied at Georgetown from mainland China. So it was the early 80s. It still wasn't very easy to get out of China and to get visas to come to the United States. But 2 of them had come and gone before I even got here. Chen Qidi and Jiangyue Zhao, who I know is part of this conversation. And Jiangyue Zhao had studied with Edie Weiss. It was one of the reasons why Edie was particularly interested in getting a Chinese law specialist on the faculty. And she had gone back to China, where she had a long, distinguished career, working first in the Ministry of Foreign Trade and Economic Cooperation in their Department of Treaties and Law, helping to do the run-up to the negotiations of China's entry into the WTO, and eventually becoming herself, and just recently she stepped down as a member of the appellate body of the WTO. So Georgetown obviously had an impact on her career, and she's had a serious impact on us because she sent many of her colleagues and co-workers in various departments that she's worked in to Georgetown, including her own son, who came here in the early 2000s and did not 1, but 2 LLM degrees back to back, and is now a practicing lawyer himself back in Beijing. But the year that I started was the year that her successor at the Department of Treaties and Law, Zhang Yuqing, came to Georgetown. And he was a student in my first Chinese law class here. He took my Chinese law seminar, wrote a paper which was published about the newly established foreign joint venture law, and went back to himself, head the Department of Treaties and Law. He brought his colleagues to Georgetown 3 times in the run-up to Georgetown's accession to the WTO to take a 3-week-long class that was co-taught by me and John Jackson, our late colleague and someone who's described as the grandfather of the WTO, to prepare for China's accession to the WTO. And John was able to bring together an extraordinary group of specialists from all over the world, not just the United States, but from Europe and Asia, who taught this very intensive course for 25 people in a class that were going to be running the various agencies that were going to be affected by China's accession to the WTO. So in that way, we've also had connection and an impact on China. And then as people know, many of whom may be on this call, the number of Chinese students here at Georgetown has grown exponentially. Up until, I say 5-10 years ago, we had a trickle of students from China, but they were not that numerous. And now we have an extraordinary group of students from China, from elsewhere in Asia as well. But their numbers have grown, and it's clear that Georgetown has put itself in a place where, because of the course offerings that we have, because of the things that we specialize in, and because of our location here in Washington, D.C., we've become a magnet for not just students from China, but all over the world. But obviously, with the Chinese population and the growth of law as a profession in China, that's been a big boon for us as well.
No, I'm glad you touched on that, because I do think that just the fundamental transformation of the student body, along with the explosive growth of the faculty, with a lot of focus on key international and comparative law subjects is a big part of the story that is Georgetown Law today. I wonder if you could say just a word or two, Jim, about how the Center for Asian Law fits into this mix. We like to sort of add value to our students' experience, and we'd like to engage deeply with our students coming from Asia and also our American students who are interested in Asia. And obviously, Center for Asian Law has evolved and had different areas of focus over time. So maybe you could talk just a little bit about that, the different roles that it's played and how you see it today.
Well, the Center for Asian Law is sort of the third avatar of our approaches to trying to do things with Asia and comparative law at Georgetown. And it's also the third name for this program. It began with a name that was, I think, confusing to many, ALPS, although there are Alps in Japan that are known as the Japan Alps. People, I think, associate the Alps with Middle Europe and Switzerland rather than with Asia. But ALPS was an acronym for the Asian Law and Policy Studies Program. And it was something that came together very early in the 1990s when someone who had worked for many years in Asia for the Ford Foundation, Carl Green, joined our faculty as an adjunct, but also as the first director of the Asian Law and Policy Studies Program. So he brought with him some funding that came primarily from the Japanese government, but also from other Asian official and NGO sources, and began producing a series of books about topics in Asian law that were important at that time, mostly having to do with international trade and investment, but also drawing somewhat on the work that he had done for many years with the Ford Foundation in Asia. Unfortunately for us, one of his contacts in Japan, Hitachi, asked him to come on board there as a legal advisor, and it was an offer too good to refuse, sort of like my offer from Georgetown. So he left us, but we were then joined in the early to mid 2000s by Susan Weld, who was a contemporary of mine, although a few years ahead of me at Harvard Law School. She had done a PhD and a JD at Harvard, specializing in her PhD in very early Chinese law, the pre-Qin, pre-imperial era of Chinese law, but also knew a lot about contemporary law, written articles about it while she was a law student herself. And she had just stepped down as the first general counsel of the Congressional Executive China Committee. She was brought on when the committee was formed as part of China's succession to the WTO. The U.S. created two bodies, the CECC, that she was the general counsel of, and then the U.S. China Commission. The U.S. China Commission is made up of lay people who are not in government, but have some background in Chinese national security and other things. The CECC's official members are all in government. It has members that are appointed by both the House and the Senate, and then 6 executive departments, each of which designates somebody to be part of this commission. But both committees have a staff that's made up of knowledgeable China specialists, many of whom have studied Chinese law, even at Georgetown and other American law schools. And as a result, they are very well informed and put out extensive annual reports. I just read over the last 2 days the USCC's 2020 report, which just came out at the end of last week.
Yes, quite good.
And it's excellent, and it's very, very detailed, over 200 single-space pages,
Yes.
chock with notes and additional things. So Susan took retirement, and after she retired, there was an obvious hole that we needed to fill, and that's when we were lucky enough to have you contact me and say that you were interested in the position that we were advertising for someone to take over the Asian law program, which had been known up until that time, since we changed from ALPS to Georgetown Law Asia. There was a moment when we thought we would have 3 sort of regional focuses at the law school in our international programs: Georgetown Law Europe, Georgetown Law Asia, and Georgetown Law Latin America. But the programs all took different directions. And so with your guidance and suggestions, we now have renamed this program the Georgetown Center for Asian Law, which I think most descriptively adequately sets out what our program's about. And I know that you've been doing great things, which I'd like you to actually talk about for at least a couple of minutes before we go to other questions, because you've been a real firebrand and done a lot for the program since you arrived at Georgetown now almost 3 years ago.
Well, Jim, I'll only spend 30 to 60 seconds saying that it's just been very exciting to work with you over the 3 years since I arrived at Georgetown, and have tried to even sort of heighten, obviously building on the work that you and Susan were doing together to sort of build further our policy focus on issues like Chinese overseas investment, the situation in Hong Kong, as well as other matters in other parts of Asia. So it's been an exciting 3 years so far. And we have a lot more to do together. I don't think it's a risky prediction to say that the U.S.-China relationship and the U.S.-Asia relationship is going to be a big part of Biden administration's foreign policy. And my hope is that our center and our work can contribute to the conversation in Washington about where to go from here. And I know that one of our questions will focus on what the new Biden team might do vis-a-vis China. And I'm sure that Biden will have among his team members, members of the Georgetown community, either folks who graduated from the law school or members of the faculty who may wander on over to the administration for some period of time. But I don't want to take up too much time myself, but I do encourage alumni who are on the call, if they want to hear more about the work that we're doing. I am available, and I know Jim is available as well to continue that conversation, because we'd love to get your advice on what we should be doing. And Chris will certainly remind me that I do need to say that we need your support because we have an ambitious agenda for the next few years, which will be crucial for the U.S.-Asia relationship. Before we are supposed to turn to all of your questions at 8:45, I'm going to do that 2 minutes early at 1 minute early, excuse me, at 8:44. And I believe that Winston Z, our distinguished alum in Hong Kong, has the first question in the queue. Winston, are you there? Winston, I can see you on the screen. Now I can hear you, I think.
Okay, all right. Yeah, thank you. Jim, how are you?
Fine, thank you.
Jim, I just have a more practical side question. A couple of years ago, two big American companies, Apple and Qualcomm, actually litigated their IP licensing dispute in the Chinese court. So the Chinese legal system is no longer so distant and abstract, but quite real for big American companies. And
Yes.
Evidently, the Chinese legal system is quite different from the American legal system. So my question is, what do you think a top American law school like Georgetown can do to increase the understanding of the Chinese legal system by the American legal profession?
Well, thank you for that question, Winston. And as you know from your own decades of distinguished practice in this field, there's a lot of room for potential misunderstanding, as well as a great need for better understanding of our two systems, how they operate, how they coincide, and where they're different. And I think one of the things that we can do at Georgetown is really educate in two directions. The Chinese students who come to us don't come here to study Chinese law. They don't need to learn a thing about Chinese law from me. But they do come to learn about our legal system and about the international trade system, the global law that we teach in many different areas at Georgetown. So we can, I think, do a very important job in training them in what the international expectations are of law and how that may impact their legal system, especially when foreigners come to litigate in Chinese courts, given the different expectations they have coming from legal systems unlike China's. At the same time, I think one of the things that we do for the students who are not from China, and especially those who are Americans who, like many of our graduates do, go into government or into private law firms and other areas of NGO service, is provide them some education about how the Chinese legal system works, create a better understanding, or maybe sort of smooth off the rough edges so there are fewer misunderstandings as to how the Chinese legal system operates. One of the things that's constantly a surprise to me, and it may be that I'm just too long in this field and somewhat jaded, is that people are surprised that the law is different in different countries. That the legal systems that aren't like ours are somehow deficient or maybe cheating if they don't have the same rules and don't operate by the same fundamental principles that we do. And it's a job, I think, for legal education to make clear that there are these differences, and they're not discrepancies necessarily. There's something that exists in the interstices of international and comparative law, and we need to be more mindful of that. And that what the Chinese are doing, I think, in trying to modernize their legal system, but also become more involved in litigation abroad, is to learn about how they fit in. Chinese entities have investments all over the world, not just here in the United States and in developed countries like Japan and Western Europe, but with the Belt and Road, Chinese entities are operating now all around the globe in countries with more and less developed legal systems. And there's a process of mutual education that can go on as we provide more information, not only for Americans, but for global consumers of information about Chinese law, how the Chinese legal system works. And then in the educational work we do, especially with the Chinese students who come here for JDs and LLMs, making sure that they are well educated and trained when they go back to China, so that they can be the cultural interpreters of how the American legal system works in the law firms and government agencies that they'll eventually work in back in mainland China.
I think that's a great point. Let me just read the next question, Jim, from Zhang Yejiao, who I know wanted to be here and did submit a question, but I think unfortunately is tied up still at the office even at this late hour. So she asks, under this current situation, difficult situation faced by the U.S.-Sino education cooperation, how can we solve problems and continue our cooperation in forming more international scholars for advancing the rule of law, fairness and justice, and as well as peace and development on the international side? Any specific ideas you have on that front, that how legal education, especially at Georgetown, can contribute to moderating some of the difficulties we're seeing both in the U.S.-China relationship and more generally in world affairs?
Well, first off, I would say that one of the things that we do here at Georgetown, and we'll continue to do as long as it's possible, is to admit qualified Chinese law students to all of our degree programs and make sure that they have an avenue to come to study in the United States. Obviously, the current COVID environment, it's been impossible for students to get visas to be able to come to the United States. But in past years, we've had over 100 Chinese students a year studying in our LLM and JD programs. And I think that's something that we intend to continue to do. We've already reached out to our Chinese students who weren't able to come here in person this academic year, so that we will have a program for them to study remotely, both this semester and in the spring semester, ramping up to try to take in more students who weren't able to get here this academic year. Aside from that, and I don't want to downplay that, I think it's very important that Chinese students come not only to Georgetown but to other leading American law schools, so they can go back to China with the skills to be cultural interpreters of the American legal system. I think that the work that we do in the Center for Asian Law and similar programs at other elite American law schools is providing the fodder for a better understanding of the Chinese legal system. There's a lot of misinformation and I think purposeful, malicious disinformation about the Chinese legal system. I'll just mention in passing a very misleading article that was published on the op-eds pages of Washington Post just in the last day or two.
Yes.
That failed to take into account the important contribution that these exchange programs make in mutual understanding. And unless we take a more clear-eyed and objective view of how those programs work, and realize that we're not trying to, either market somebody else's system to our country, our political leaders, or our people in corporations and law firms, we're trying to be, explainers of how systems are different, and they are.
Yes.
And at the same time, we want to make sure that people who come to Georgetown to try to understand the American legal system know full well just how our system operates, and that these things are, and it's difficult, especially in the current administration, which mercifully will be over in a few short weeks, that there are rules. There are rules that are neutral and are not meant to give anybody an unfair advantage or disadvantage somebody who's not our nationals, and that's something that we want to work towards in a global way to make sure that everybody plays on a level playing field, both in things like international trade, but also in the way they're treated fairly by domestic courts when they come in as foreigners, and expect to get even-handed justice and not be biased or prejudiced against because of their nationality or because their government is at odds with our government.
Yeah, I think those are all great points, and I can only say that I completely agree. And I do hope that we're making a contribution in that way over the longer term to greater understanding and hopefully better relations. Let me turn it over to our distinguished alumnus based in Taiwan, Johnny Chang, who has our next question. Johnny, are you there?
Well, it's always good to see you both, Tom, Professor Feinerman and Tom.
Good to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you, and hope you all stay healthy in Washington, D.C. during the coronavirus pandemic. And my question is about the Biden administration, and as Tom just mentioned, because during the presidential election, it's very surprising that a huge number of Taiwanese people, they actually support Donald Trump, because most of them think that Trump administration is relatively tough on China and relatively friendly to Taiwan. So my question is, do you expect the Biden administration will make any major changes to the Chinese policy, particularly in the aspect of trade and the issue of Hong Kong, and of course the issue of Taiwan?
Excellent question. Oh, Jim, I think you're still on mute. If you unmute yourself, Jim, I would love to take a crack at that question, but I want to give you the first opportunity.
I think he might actually be frozen.
Okay, so I'll give you a first response, Johnny, and then I'm sure that Jim will be coming back to us momentarily. You can't have a Zoom call of this massive size without some degree of technical difficulties. So now that we've had that, let me just quickly say, I do think you will see a shift with the incoming Biden administration. And I mean, first, I think they know that this is not the time for a recycling of the Obama era policy. So you're not going to see some sort of excessively rapid shift from confrontation to uncritical engagement. But what I do think you'll see is a more judicious mix of carrots and sticks, if I can use the Washington metaphor, an effort to look for places where the US and China can cooperate, whether it be on public health or the environment or other issues, while at the same time acknowledging that there are areas of competition and that a firmer line is needed, whether it be on human rights, whether it be on trade, or some of the other issues where we have seen growing tensions in the US-China relationship. But that's just a quick taste. It looks like Jim his technical difficulties are over. Jim, do you want to put a few thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Tom has said. Am I being heard?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Some technical difficulties here. I think two things that are important to know about the incoming administration. One is they have a stable of people who have previously been working in previous U.S. government administrations, but are very knowledgeable Asia hands as well. One of the problems with the Trump administration is that the most important issues in the relationship with Asia have been left to total amateurs. People like Peter Navarro, who are, just, I won't sugarcoat it, they're idiots. As a result, they've pursued very foolish policies, but they also haven't listened to, and in fact, they've muted or dismissed the real experts that were there, especially in the professional ranks of the State Department, the CIA, and elsewhere, who have told them, you're doing the wrong things. This is not working. This is not going to make sense in trying to affect policy. And since, the current president believes he's his own best foreign policy advisor, he's not taking any of the advice that's coming in that might, moderate his policies and also make some of them more achievable. And I think that's going to change when, President Biden steps in, because he will be listening to the experts and he'll be able to take advantage of a much wider range of people who aren't necessarily going to roll over. I think that's the fear in the relationship between mainland China and the US, but also with regard to Taiwan. The Biden administration has no interest in abandoning any of the advances that have been made with Taiwan. And I think they'll be very glad to continue strengthening the relationship that they have with Taiwan in general, but also with the Tsai Ing-wen administration. At the same time, I believe that they're going to try and, reach more of a rapprochement with mainland China, just because the situation has been so ridiculously parlous up to now. China, like it or not, whether you think of them as a friend or a foe, is just too important not to be giving serious attention to, not to be throwing barbs at, not to be talking about kung flu or the other sorts of things that the very unpresidential behavior on the part of Donald Trump. But saying, we face mutual problems. This pandemic is clear evidence of the kind of things that we have to sort out among ourselves. And with better communication and with the willingness to engage, we might have had a much different outcome in the current global pandemic. But the die was already cast by the time the pandemic broke out in China. And as a result, we botched it. I'm not going to do blame casting right now. But it seems that should be a lesson for us to absorb about how we can improve the relationship. I want to say one other thing just about Taiwan. I think that the time has come for a serious revision of what we believe our relationship is with Taiwan. For too long, we've been willing to pursue this strategic ambiguity that was laid out by Kissinger in the initial approaches after the Nixon visit to China in 1972. That was 50 years ago. We need to update and think about Taiwan and it wasn't at the time, to be fair, it wasn't a mature democracy in 1972. It was a military dictatorship, but that changed, and it's been changed for 3 decades now. We need to take account of that, but we also have to take account of the fact that the idea that we can play with the fate of the 20-some million people who live in Taiwan and decide whether they remain independent or get surrendered, to Chinese suzerainty. That's not our call, and we have to make that clear, globally, but especially to the mainland, and that we do have a serious interest in maintaining the freedom and separateness. I won't use the word independence of Taiwan, and making sure that the mainland doesn't make any foolish moves because they believe that the U.S. has lost interest after 5 decades. In trying to continue this relationship that protects the freedom and independence of Taiwan.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. I think those. Go ahead, Johnny. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think people in Taiwan would love to hear that, because after Biden becomes the president-elect, and actually many Taiwanese people start worried about the future between the China-Taiwan relationship and the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. So Yeah, and I think many Taiwanese people were very glad to hear that, and I definitely will pass those messages and those opinions to my colleagues and my friends and families. So thank you, Professor
It would be a good first step if Tsai Ing-wen publicly congratulates President-elect Biden. She was, quick to react to Donald Trump's election in 2016. I think showing similar alacrity about the Biden administration will be important in beginning the process that makes it possible for Biden to say, yeah, we're on the same page now.
Yep.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, I think that's a great thought. And I want to turn to our illustrious alum Insol, Jung-Yi Kim, but before I do, I can't resist mentioning that some of the folks who have already asked questions, including Jung-Yi himself, obviously speak to the kind of alums that we have across Asia who are sort of richly involved in key policy debates, and who are also, we are very thankful that they're loyal alums of Georgetown. So Jung-Yi, I'm thankful that you're on the call. It's good to see you again, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Tom. Hi, Jim. It's a great honor to be part of the event. Greetings from Seoul. I just wanted to make a quick thank you to you, Jim. You've always been a great mentor to me, and you're kind of like my Jerry Cohen, if I could say so. So I have a general question for you, and I was just wondering, because we're always curious about the future of where we're going. And so if the sky was the limit, and you had, in a perfect world, resources were not an issue, what would be the kind of ultimate goal for the center and the Asian Law Program in your mind?
Well, you ask a very interesting question, because I've been thinking about this a lot, especially since I've now been given a second duty and a new chair to work on the Denny Center for Democratic Capitalism, which I don't think is at odds with my previous work in Asian law, but it means that I'm going to have my attention, or my scholarly attention, divided now between two different programs. I think if we had all the resources and my faculty colleagues were willing to go along, I'd like to see at least 5 full-time faculty members who focus on Asia, each of whom has a specific background and a scholarly interest in China, Greater China, speaking China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, which obviously remains important. It's the 3rd largest economy in the world. We've temporized, we've had many visitors teaching Japanese law for us, but we've never had a full-time faculty member devoted to teaching Japanese law. Sometimes I've had to pitch in, and luckily we can draw on illustrious alumni and famous Japanese law professors who are eager to come to Washington and teach at Georgetown. But we need to have somebody who's a full-time Japan specialist. I also believe we need to have someone who focuses on Korean law, and Korean law broadly, not just the legal system of South Korea, which I believe the Republic of Korea is an important economy on its own, and has an interesting and highly developed legal system that's worthy of study. But obviously the security relationships that the United States has with South Korea, and the interest that we have in regard to the North Korean nuclear threat, means that there's a lot to teach about in that area that we would want to, I think, have a full-time faculty member who's got some expertise related to Korea. And then we have, luckily, somebody who does Southeast Asia, who's about to become a tenured member of our faculty, Yvonne Chu. So I think it's important that we teach, and other American law schools as well, teach about Southeast Asian law. She's a native of Malaysia, but she has broader interests throughout Southeast and East Asia. And I think that that's an area that we will have covered, luckily. And then the 5th and final area that I think we need a full-time faculty member is the Indian subcontinent. It would be very important, the world's largest democracy, soon to be the world's largest country in terms of population. And Tom, I know, has valuable insights into India. It's one of the things that made me very interested in drawing him to Georgetown as the director for the Center of Asian Law. because he has multiple strings to his bow. He's not just a China specialist. But it would be great to have a full-time faculty member teaching India. If we had those 5 Asian countries covered, and I know there's a lot of the rest of the world, we probably need to have a specialist in Russian or Soviet law, which we don't have on the full-time faculty. We do have specialists in European comparative law on our full-time faculty too, both Franz Vero and a younger colleague, Philomila Soukala, who's originally from Greece. So we've got that covered. But Asia is going to be, important in the coming Pacific century, and it's one of those things that I think not Georgetown, but other American law schools as well can't afford to ignore.
I think those are all great points to end on, and I certainly will second your comment, Jim, that there's so much more that we can be doing on the Asian law front, and having some additional faculty come in. Maybe I can say particularly with the South Asian expertise, which I think will be a key part of U.S. foreign policy in the years to come. As well as global affairs. So hopefully from your lips to the higher authorities' ears, we can continue that conversation. And I hope that all of us can continue the conversation after this obviously extremely rich and informative session. Anyone who doesn't have my email, Chris does have it, and Chris has been reaching out to all of you on a regular basis to set up this fantastic discussion. So feel free to write to me directly if there's anything that I can do for you, either in general or vis-a-vis continuing this conversation on Asian law at Georgetown, because we do want to hear your thoughts in terms of where we can go from here, in terms of continuing to develop what Jim has started in terms of one of the United States leading Asian law programs. Jim, any final words before we bring the session to a close?
Well, a couple of things. I would just mention that Georgetown's been very active in the public realm with regard to Asian law.
Yes.
One of my proudest moments at the Law Center was when Bill Clinton came, while he was still president in 2000, to a dedication ceremony for the new Houghton building, which was about to have ground broken. So the Houghton Center opened in 2004, but in 2000 there was a groundbreaking ceremony, and Mr. Houghton, who among many of his other generosities was a benefactor for Bill Clinton's presidential campaigns, managed to cajole President Clinton to come to the Law Center, and in the Law Center auditorium, the Hart Auditorium, we had the dedication ceremony, which then we went outside to break the ground for the new Houghton building. And he singled out John Jackson and me for the training program that we had been doing for the Chinese government officials who were going to be implementing the WTO. And it made it pretty clear that Georgetown was taking full advantage of the possibilities that were presented to us by being the leading law school in the nation's capital, and the kind of things we could do both for the world and for the United States in the kind of training that we provided. So I think that was a bright, shining moment. The other thing that I would just mention is that every year when I see the graduates who've completed their course of study, either in the LLM program or those who have done a JD, it's amazing to me to see how many of them increasingly are from Asia. And of course, indistinguishably, there also are Asian American students who have grown up in the United States. But it's a significant cohort at Georgetown. And that's something that wasn't the case when I arrived in 1985, but it's been transformative over the last 35 years. And since I just turned 70, I've now spent half my life at Georgetown Law.
Wow. Well, that is, I think, a fantastic note to end on in terms of the contributions that Georgetown has made in the public sphere. And I think you're absolutely right to highlight that, Jim. And I will just close by saying all of those contributions, both in the educational space and in the public space, are obviously a direct result of all that you've given to Georgetown. So I can say thank you for that. I know my colleagues on this call join me in thanking you for that. And I know the alums thank you for that as well. I think Junyi said it best when he said that for a lot of us, myself included, you are a Jerry Cohen mentor type figure. And Georgetown is lucky to have you, and we're lucky to have you. So thank you, and thank you to all of you who are joining from Asia. Please do keep the lines of communications open, and we will be talking with you and seeing you again soon.